if there's one thing movies are good at, it's blowing things up. It's fun, it's epic, it's total cinema, baby.
Tell me you got that.
I got it.
Since the beginning, movies have been a canvas for showing off explosions, and that tradition lives on to the present day. The marketing for the movie Oppenheimer shows that the promise of an explosion is itself enough to justify a ticket purchase. So it's something moviegoers love to talk about, and yet there's almost no discussion about the meaning of those explosions. Why do we love them? What purpose do they serve? And in our favorite movies, what deserves to be blown up? To get to the bottom of movie kabooms, there's first one rule you've got to learn.
Yeah, cool guys don't look at explosions. They blow things up and then walk away.
At the 2009 MTV Movie Awards, The Lonely Island released the music video Cool Guys Don't Look at Explosions, pointing out that despite explosions looking cool, it's uncool to look at them.
Who's got time to watch an explosion? There's cool guy areas that they have to walk to.
This trope is so common because it combines the spectacle of an explosion with narrative fulfillment. It's not just a cool explosion, but also the appeal of seeing our cool heroes succeed. They don't need to turn around because they're so confident in what they're doing. And this trope goes as far back as the Bible. In Genesis 19, God destroys the city of Sodom because of the evil living there, and instructs Lot and his family to walk away from the explosions without looking back. While fleeing, Lot's wife does turn around to look, so God punishes her by turning her into a pillar of salt. So according to the Bible, looking back on God's destruction is not just uncool, it's a mortal sin, because it shows a lack of faith in the certainty of God's commands. So in both the Bible and in action movies, the impulse to look away from the explosion shows the narrative has a biblical certainty to it. It means the hero is so sure of their actions, they don't dare commit the sin of thinking twice. In the movie Shooter, Mark Wahlberg is wearing a hat as he walks away from an explosion. In this movie, he can walk away with confidence because he's blowing up the cabin of the film's antagonist, a US senator seemingly as wicked as the city of Sodom. He not only frames Wahlberg's character in a criminal conspiracy, but also perpetuates brutal war crimes overseas. Explosions like this one visualize the complete and utter destruction of an objectively evil villain. Thanks to an explosion, a story's climax is no longer some abstract element of the hero's journey, but rather an epic climax we can see with our very eyes. Ironically, the explosion in Shooter is completely unnecessary. Wahlberg's character already killed all the men in the cabin, so the explosion exists not for some functional purpose, but as a clear symbol that Wahlberg successfully destroyed corruption in Washington. Like many revenge movies, he fulfills the fantasy of cleaning house, giving us that satisfying conclusion that, according to the movie itself, we don't often get in real life.
Justice does not always prevail. It's not the Wild West where you can clean up the streets with a gun.
This idea of a clear and swift justice explains why so many iconic movies end with not just explosions, but the explosion. The cool guy saving the day so clearly and spectacularly. So not looking at explosions serves three purposes. First, it shows the hero's absolute certainty in their mission. Second, it shows the clear defeat of some antagonist. And third, it's awesome. But in movies, explosions aren't all fun and spectacle. In some cases, you're the target.
And you, duck and cover.
Throughout the atomic age, the world lived with the very real threat of nuclear annihilation, and that fear extended into popular movies. Movies like Godzilla, War of the Worlds, and later Independence Day show aliens destroying cities, which, according to the original Godzilla's director, served as clear parallels to the destruction of an atomic explosion. Let's not think that monster movies are ridiculous, but make movies from the perspective of hatred and amazement at the horrors of the atomic bomb. So in contrast to Cool Guys Don't Look at Explosions, movies about the atomic bomb often show destruction from the perspective of the victims. Instead of cool guys looking away from explosions, it's innocent people looking at them and facing the brutal consequences.
アメリカではマンハッタン計画と呼ばれ、オッペンハイマーをはじめとする科学者たちが
The movie Barefoot Gen, based on the comic of the same name, has one of the best and cruelest depictions of an atomic explosion in movie history, showing the explosion and aftermath of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. All the stylistic choices feel like the complete opposite of the cool guy looking away. In the scene, the initial explosion is not some epic set piece, but it's instead viewed objectively from a bird's eye view, far away from the city. At first, the bomb doesn't create some spectacular effect. In fact, it actually removes color from each shot, desaturating them into black and white. We lose all audio, time slows down, and each shot is simple and static. For emphasis, we watch several locations lose their color, further distorting time by putting the initial explosion on loop. But then, focused on a girl with a red balloon, the sound and color returns, as colors stream chaotically across a moving background, and dynamic shots of melting civilians zoom in and out at random. I'm using screenshots here because the original footage is so disturbing, but I'll link it in the description. From here, we move from individuals to the landscape, seeing the physical destruction the bomb causes. And now we get a third color palette, not the original regular palette, or the black and white, but now an intense saturation, as even the matte painting in the background physically tears apart. This sequence in Barefoot Gen feels truly apocalyptic. The combination of random changes in color palette, the distortion of time, the move from silent to loud, and all the many objects and people moving in different directions challenge our preconceived notions of how explosions feel. To the victims of Hiroshima, it's not a single blast, but an onslaught of changing color, motion, and sound. When the cool guy walks away, it feels like Lot, obeying God's command and fulfilling God's will of absolute certainty. But those in Hiroshima are the victims of the city of Sodom, and we, the viewer, are Lot's wife, daring to look back at the carnage. Barefoot Gen shows the gulf that exists between explosions as fun spectacle and explosions felt by innocent people. But many movies find their moral alignment somewhere in the middle, such as the famous Flight of the Valkyries scene in Apocalypse Now. In the scene, US soldiers bomb a village in Vietnam, and like Barefoot Gen, the scene does highlight the victims of the attack, showing fleeing children and unarmed civilians. But the movie runs into conflict with itself because of how spectacular the explosions feel. It's hard to tell whether the famous music in the background satirizes the brutal attack, or it makes the scene more fun to watch, making the soldiers feel like certain gods, punishing the sinners of Sodom, especially since the Flight of the Valkyries song is a piece from an opera about the heroic Valkyries in Norse mythology preparing for a final apocalyptic battle. In the movie Jarhead, soldiers watch this exact scene in Apocalypse Now and actively cheer it on, clearly endorsing the destruction in the movie within a movie. As director Francis Ford Coppola himself has said, an anti-war film cannot glorify war, and Apocalypse Now arguably does. But some movies use this conflict between spectacle and terror to their advantage. The movie Paths of Glory has one of the earliest examples of the cool guy not looking at an explosion, but at the same time, that scene shows the futility of war by wasting his heroic certainty on a lost cause. In the movie, Major General Brollard orders Colonel Dax and his men to charge on a well-defended German position, a suicide mission that will inevitably fail, and after it does, Brollard puts random soldiers on trial for retreating. The movie shows the pointlessness of war by showing not some distant evil, but an evil within the army itself. At one point, Major General Brollard even gives orders to drop bombs on his own men to get them to advance, exacting a godlike wrath as punishment for any soldier's uncertainty in the mission. So Colonel Dax's bravery amongst spectacular explosions is all for nothing, challenging the very idea that such certainty has a place in war. Both Apocalypse Now and Paths of Glory capture the dilemma faced by war films, finding the balance between engrossing spectacle and senseless violence. Lots of movies have to walk this very fine line, and if you look closely, the real meaning of the explosion does often get lost in the spectacle. It actually happens so often, you may not even notice it. The movie Die Hard stars John McClane, a New York police officer who tries to stop German terrorists from taking over Nakatomi Plaza in downtown LA. The movie openly critiques capitalism, satirizing the Nakatomi Corporation as a cruel company exploiting people around the world.
Our project in Indonesia, contrary to what you people may think, we're going to develop that region, not exploit it.
When the terrorists do take over the building, they get compared to businessmen.
Business is business. You use a gun, I use a fountain pen. What's the difference?
And through this lens, our hero John McClane acts as a clear foil. He's a blue-collar worker from New York City, bewildered by the white-collar party full of champagne and kissing men. Instead of business attire, he wears a plain tank top and walks barefoot, as he literally climbs up the corporate ladder to the top of the building to dispose of the German terrorists. The movie clearly pokes at American anxieties about corporate greed, the encroachment of foreign capital, and the flagrant, unregulated economy of the 1980s. But I want to suggest suggests that the explosions in the movie tell the real story. Like many action movies, there are several cool explosions, like one at the bottom of the building and one on the roof. But crucially, nothing actually gets destroyed. Nakatomi Plaza stays structurally intact, and the deputy chief describes it as simply property damage. Unlike Shooter or Barefoot Jen, nothing really gets destroyed here. It's just there for spectacle's sake. And I don't have a problem with an explosion being there just to be cool, but Die Hard shows how an explosion can get in the way of the messaging of the movie. The dialogue tries to critique capitalism, but the explosions show how the movie doesn't go very far in that critique. If the movie were really anti-capitalist, the explosions would have destroyed Nakatomi Plaza, the obvious symbol of cruel capitalism that the movie openly challenges. But because the building remains intact, it's not really rejecting capitalism. John McClane isn't a hero destroying corporate greed. Instead, he shows that all we need is a blue-blooded American to take charge and show the foreigners how it's done. Die Hard is an excellent action movie, but a close look at the actual impotence of the explosions shows that the critiques really have no bite. And American movies have a long tradition of tepid capitalist critiques in their explosions. Recently, Glass Onion and The Menu feature explosions, and I won't spoil the details for those that haven't watched, but for those who have, consider how those explosions work so hard to critique the ruling class, but in the end, their explosions don't really challenge existing power structures. They just get rid of a few bad apples at the top and leave the system intact. And it's for these reasons that I especially appreciate American Psycho, which is also a critique of capitalism, but at least it uses explosions not to create some false sense of critiquing an oppressive system, but rather, it uses explosions to acknowledge the absurdity of Patrick Bateman's situation, that he can cruise as a vice president and go so far as to kill people, all in a system that lets him get away scot-free. Of course, not all movies have to have some grand critique, but on the other hand, it was very refreshing to watch the movie How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which has the same suspenseful cinematic explosions like the ones in Die Hard, and the explosions actually raise interesting questions about the validity of destroying property to make systemic change. You may not agree with the methods or the politics of the movie, but regardless, it's exciting how the explosions in the movie actually create a conversation, as opposed to laughing at a fun but powerless satire. Which brings us to the toughest question of all. How do you balance spectacle, destruction, and politics with the most spectacular, the most destructive, and the most political explosion in human history? America dropped the atomic bomb on Japan not just for its ability to destroy cities and kill people en masse. Military officials also knew that the spectacle of such a large explosion, like the spectacle of explosions in movies, served a huge amount of the impact. So even in real-life explosions, we share that same conflict between spectacle and cruelty, between narrative certainty and narrative ambiguity. And that's what makes explosions a fascinating but terrifying concept, because it's not just what blows up, it's who. And it looks like the movie Oppenheimer will explore that exact idea. The marketing of the movie, like the bomb itself, promises the movie magic spectacle of an explosion of biblical proportions, while also exploring the moral dilemma that such a device introduced.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
But don't take my word for it. Now, you see it.